Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and thanks for joining this morning's webinar discussing ways and means to replace your MPLS and looking at whether SD-WAN, modern SD-WAN provides a useful answer to some of the challenges with MPLS replacement. My name is Shona Bradshaw. I'm the Marketing Communications Manager at Bytes Security Partnerships, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Peter Lee from KATO Networks, who'll be taking you through the bulk of today's technical presentation. So just a few bits of agenda for today. I will give a short introduction to Bytes Security Partnerships. I will keep that brief, as many of you know us already, before talking to you around some of the challenges of the traditional network and MPLS. Then I'll be handing over to Peter, who'll be talking around a new model for the WAN, introducing KATO Cloud, and discussing varied means and methods of enhancing both security and user experience when looking at MPLS replacement. We'll then have an interactive Q&A at the end. So a little bit of housekeeping for today's session. Attendee lines are on mute throughout today's presentation, but of course we do welcome questions throughout this. It's designed to should be an interactive session. So if as questions occur to you throughout the session or at the end, please do post them via the chat or the questions box, and I'll come back on at the end and ask all of your different questions to Peter. In terms of the rules of engagement for today's session, we will be talking strategy and solutions and technology on the session. We won't be getting in-depth into particular contracts and commercials on the session. Of course, those conversations are more than welcome after the webinar via your Bytes account manager. We are recording today's session and we'll make that available to everyone who's dialed in and those of you that couldn't make it live. And lastly, a quick request from me. We do have a very short 5-question feedback survey at the end. If you could take 1 to 2 minutes to fill that in at the end, it will enable us to make sure that our webinars are continuing to hit the mark for you content-wise. So, who are Bytes Security Partnerships? We are the specialist security reseller between the Bytes Technology Group. We were bought by Bytes in 2011, and what we've aimed to do since then is to marry up the agility, insight, and the very personal specialist approach that you would expect from the smallest, most specialist partner with the scale and global resources and the delivery capacity that comes from being part of a much larger global group. We're exceptionally proud at Bytes Security Partnerships of the technical resources that we offer around all of the vendor technologies that we work with. We offer in-house technical support, project planning, scoping, etc. And this allows us to enjoy top-tier vendor statuses and partnerships, which essentially means for our end-user organisations that they get better commercial value as well as a high degree of technical capability. We work across the full spectrum of information security, from next-generation firewalling, network access and traditional network security side, through to more modern technologies such as cloud, mobility, data security, identity, access and authentication. So anything security and looking to develop your business in a secure fashion is where that we would be helping you out. What we offer across all of these areas is that extension of your IT security teams. Whether you're looking for support to develop and deliver technologies, install and maintain them, whether you're looking to develop and look at the marketplace and understand future threats and what technologies may fit those areas, whether you're looking to map your existing technology and get the best value out of it. We have a suite of technical services and a team of accredited engineers that can assist across the board. So that's more than enough about us. Why are we speaking to businesses, and why are businesses increasingly coming to us to talk about replacing MPLS and looking at a new model for their WAN? It's very simple to securely connect an organisation when it has predictable traffic flows from branches to data centres, but today's businesses and the demands on them from their end users are radically different. There are very different challenges with traditional WANs and MPLS, such as reliability, such as the desire to increase the return on investment and reduce the amount of appliances and the cost of appliances going out there, the need to support an increasing amount of mobile and remote workers in an effective manner, but also in a secure fashion. So the reason that we brought you here today is to gain some insight from the KATO team on the latest tools, tactics and strategies that you can be adopting to make sure you're aware of those, so that you can look to have a fresh approach and potentially meet some of these challenges in a more effective way. So all that remains for me to do is to introduce your guest speaker for today. Peter Lee, who's a senior sales engineer across EMEA at KATO Networks. KATO are pioneering cloud-based and secure global SD-WAN, an SD-WAN that's essentially different to traditional SD-WAN. They have an absolutely fantastic background, founded by key pioneers in the information security space, including Shlomo Kramer, who co-founded Checkpoint, who created the first commercial firewall, and also was involved in Imperva, who innovated the web application firewall. We are seeing an explosive demand in the conversations that we are having around SD-WAN, and as part of that, we're having a great amount of growth from KATO. So who better to come and speak to you today around how you can rethink your security architecture from the ground up to meet some of these MPLS challenges. So I'm just going to hand over to Peter, mute myself off, and I will be coming back on at the end to ask Peter your questions. Over to Peter.
Thank you very much, Shona. I'm just showing my screen now. Hopefully you can see my slides.
I can indeed. I'll just mute myself off now.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this session. My name is Peter Lee. I'm a senior sales engineer for KATO Networks in EMEA. I actually came to KATO from Imperva, so I've been part of the Shlomo Kramer family for almost a decade now. As you can hear from the accent, I wasn't always from the UK. I actually am from Australia. I grew up, spent most of my life in Queensland. I moved to the UK in 2015, and so I'm frequently asked, why would anyone move from Australia to the UK, especially from Brisbane to the UK? You can see there, that's where I grew up, spent most of my life, and that's what life is like for me now. So it's a fair question. Unfortunately, I'm not going to answer it today. We might hold that over for a future webinar. So what I wanted to talk about today and start the conversation with is about challenges, and Shona mentioned some of those challenges during the intro. In particular, I want to call out, I guess, the 5 most common challenges that customers mention to myself and my sales guys when we're out talking to them. So I'm not talking high level strategic. I didn't do a survey of 100 leading CEOs and CIOs. This is just my experience, mainly here in the UK market, talking to people about the sort of challenges that SD-WAN solves. And the first one, and I think the most obvious one, is global connectivity. If you have, say, an office in London and you have an office in Birmingham, so we're not too far away, then MPLS is probably not a bad solution for that. But if you then also have offices in Sydney, in Johannesburg, in the US, East and West Coast, in places like Shanghai and Singapore, then MPLS can become certainly become an expensive, but also challenging in terms of performance and latency and provider management. So the most obvious way, I guess you can say, that we meet that challenge is with our global network. We currently have 47 POPs. By the time we finish this presentation, it might be 48. That's how quick we can deploy them. And we do have a very enthusiastic expansion schedule for points of presence. So these are locations around the globe in tier 1 data centers with really good connectivity, where we deploy our converged security and networking stack. They are connected via our own tier 1 links. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that it would be easy for us to just go out and put these points of presence out there, connect them with VPN tunnels, and then run our customers' VPN tunnels over those VPN tunnels. But that would be inefficient, and to be honest, the customers would be better off just having their own direct VPN tunnels. So what we do when we stand a POP up is we have a pool of about 5 preferred global carriers. We'll go to them and we'll say, we need a link from this location to half a dozen other locations on our backbone with no more than this much latency, with no more than this much packet loss and jitter. So we get links that are not only high speed, but are also backed with SLAs around their performance. So they're private links, they're dedicated to us, and then with that mesh of these good quality links between our locations, we can offer customers an alternative when they want to go from point A to B around the globe. So we've got these POPs connected by this backbone with a network and security stack. We've added in our fancy WAN optimization, traffic optimization, prioritization, quality of service software. We've added in our security stack, the firewall, next-gen anti-malware, the IPS that I'll talk about in future slides. What we then do is we let customers connect to those POPs. Typically, they'll connect to the closest POP in terms of round trip time, and they will usually connect with the little device that you can see represented by that icon there just above the branch logo. That's a socket. I'll put a picture of an actual socket up in a few slides' time. It's a small hardware appliance that effectively extends our perimeter directly out to the customer's location in that particular site. That's our preferred way of connecting the customer. That's how most KATO customers connect their sites to the KATO backbone. The socket has the intelligence to know where the nearest POP is, and it is frequently, when I say frequently, it's many times per minute, assessing reachability and distance to all of the other POPs. So each socket on a customer site knows at any time where the closest POP is, but also importantly, where the second closest POP and the third closest POP and so on are, so that if there is any kind of disruption to the POP, the socket can immediately fail over and retain service for that customer. Now, not everyone can deploy a socket. There are examples such as in a cloud data center, in an AWS VPC or an Azure virtual network where you can't walk into their data center with one of our sockets under your arm. But what you can do is establish an IPSec tunnel, either using the native cloud VPN technology, or if you have an on-premise firewall or a virtual firewall, say in a VPC or virtual network, establishing an IPSec tunnel from that to our POP. So that's a really neat, convenient way for customers to be able to connect to the backbone in situations where, for whatever reason, it's not possible to deploy one of our sockets. We also have a mobile client. It runs on Windows, of course, runs on Mac OS, runs on Linux, Android, iPhone, and Chrome OS as well. And that's really useful for people who need to be able to connect to the WAN, but they're not currently at a customer site. The mobile client is really neat functionality. It has the intelligence, for example, to know when a user is currently at a site behind a socket. And so if the user opens a VPN client, it knows it's already on the backbone, and it will just say, okay, I'm here. I don't need to establish a tunnel. If it's outside of the customer site, so say an internet cafe, airport waiting lounge, then it will bring the tunnel up and it will secure the communication. And that, as well as giving the mobile user access to resources on the WAN, it also gives the admins visibility and control and the ability to inspect that traffic for security purposes. So it really extends their security perimeter out to everywhere that these mobile users are located. It's not just about providing access to WAN resources, and in fact, probably a majority of our customers' use cases for access to resources, it's to resources that aren't on their WAN. So it's, for example, to Office 365 deployments. That's an extremely common use case for us. It's for access to ERP applications, to other SaaS applications. And I guess this is where the software-defined element of the WAN comes in. It's not just about routing, it's about steering as well. So customer with, say, an ERP software that's located in a data center in London, in a point of presence in London. When their users are in the UK, they're accessing that, they're egressing out through our London POP, that's great. Customer then travels, say, down to Australia, they've now got to hop across the internet to get to that ERP software. But if they run the mobile client or if they have a socket down there, they can connect to our POP in Australia, be routed across our backbone, which remember is low latency SLA backed links, and then they can actually emerge onto the internet from our London location. It's a very powerful use case. A lot of our customers take advantage of that ability to steer traffic to make sure that they egress from a location around the world that makes sense from a performance and sometimes from a security perspective as well. And then on top of all of that, we layer some managed services, things like hands-free deployment, hands-free management, intelligent last mile monitoring, which we'll talk about in more detail, all the way up to full service security. Basically, you are renting our SOC capability to run on your WAN and internet infrastructure. So that was the global connectivity challenge, and really that slide there is kind of the money slide. When I'm out talking with my sales guys to customers, we generally spend a lot of time talking about the architecture on this slide. If there's one slide in this whole presentation that you take away from today, I would very much like it to be this one here. And I believe that we'll make available a copy of some of these slides after the presentation, so you have this to refer to. So the second challenge that we often come across is appliance sprawl. And I think we kind of know what this is. Shona touched on it in the intro. Effectively, this is the tradition in the industry of solving problems with individual point solutions that are often based on physical appliances. So you need a firewall, that's an appliance. You need a VPN concentrator, that's another appliance. You need a reverse proxy, that's another appliance. A URL filter, that's another appliance, and so on and so on. It's inefficient, it's wasteful, it's definitely not environmentally friendly, and it becomes very difficult to manage, not just from a technical perspective, but you've got half a dozen different vendor relationships to manage, support contracts to manage and try and co-term, and it's just not fun. The other way that we've seen organizations try to meet this challenge is by outsourcing it to a telco. So your friendly neighborhood telco comes along and says, good news, everybody, I can take away this pain for you. I can provide you all of this functionality, look after this gear for you for one price. It's normally a significant price. And unfortunately, because under the hood, it's still half a dozen different vendors' kit, the end user all too often sees friction. There are issues, the telco doesn't know, it's vendor A blaming vendor B, and it's just not really what you would call value for money, especially given the considerable amount of money that you'll often pay for that. So managing that complexity is just not what a lot of customers want. They come to a solution like KATO, where we've taken those half a dozen different appliances, often physical appliances, and we've effectively done in that space what Amazon have done in application infrastructure space. So if you think about what Amazon have done with AWS, where they've taken storage, database, compute, web serving, code as a service, infrastructure as a service, they've virtualized all of that, and they've made it easy for customers to deploy and consume as and when they need to. We've effectively done that for wide area networking and for network security in the WAN. We virtualized those into our stack, made them effectively a single product, a single vendor that customers can deal with. This is the only hardware that we ever need to deploy. It is in fact the only hardware we sell. And this is the socket. There are two models. I'm not sure why, but whoever from KATO Marketing put together those screenshots, that X1500 on the left-hand side, they've actually drawn out the perspective. It's much smaller than that in real life. It's literally about the size of a paperback novel. It would be less than War and Peace, probably about the size of the Da Vinci Code. So we put that box out at our customer sites. We can run them as HA pairs. They're low power devices. They have multiple network interfaces. They're intelligent to a point. And what I mean by that is that they work in conjunction with the backbone, with the functionality in the POPs, to provide a good balance between trying to do things at the edge, which requires lots of compute power and risk, as opposed to doing things centrally. So the sockets work in conjunction with the central POPs that they connect to. They can also work in conjunction with each other across connections such as MPLS links. We'll have more to say on that later. So I mentioned the mobile client. I've got a screenshot there on the right-hand side of how it looks. That's Windows and Mac look like that when it's connected. We have the ability with it to do things like enforce that particular users will always prefer particular POPs when they connect. So in other words, if you want to short circuit that POP selection functionality, wherever your users go, they might always connect to the same POP. And that might be useful from a geographical perspective, from a risk-based perspective, from a GDPR, EU perspective. We can also do things like ensure that the client starts or launches on startup and that it's always running before the user logs in. So it can become a very useful addition to a network and server administrator's armory. We are currently working on, and it's soon to enter into alpha availability with selected customers, an SDP client, software-defined perimeter. So this is effectively clientless VPN. This is where the user will go to a particular web page, they'll authenticate via SSO using the customer's directory or source of truth, and then they'll be presented with icons that represent different applications, email, file shares, and so forth. They click on those, and they're provided access to that via the KATO network. So there are some really exciting developments coming down the line in terms of our mobile client offerings as well. So that was Appliance Sprawl, how we can solve that by collapsing that down into those single small paperback size socket appliances. The third challenge that customers talk about, and we have this discussion every time we're talking to customers and prospects, and that's around the last mile. And it's not surprising that we would have this conversation because we are not a telco. We do not provide last mile connectivity. So clearly that's going to be a major element of our conversation with customers. So if KATO doesn't provide the last mile, who do we get that from, and how do we manage that? How do we prevent the last mile from becoming an impediment to a successful SD-WAN conversation? So I guess us not providing the last mile really opens the field up. It means you can get your last mile from anyone. Could be 4G, could be MPLS, could be direct internet access, metropolitan wireless, whatever is available, whatever floats your boat. What we do to help customers overcome these challenges with that is even though we don't provide it, we treat that link like it's our own link. So we will monitor it. We can provide customers with the ability to do speed tests from their socket over the last mile or via KATO direct to the internet or not. We're constantly checking it for things like added latency, for jitter, for distance. And then we're not just monitoring it, we can also help customers manage that. So if, for example, we detect that there's an issue with one of their last mile connections, so maybe the link's down, or maybe the latency has exceeded a certain threshold, or the rate of packet loss has exceeded a predefined threshold, then we can actually raise a ticket on the customer's behalf with their ISP and effectively step in and manage that whole interaction so that the customer doesn't have to do that. So effectively, customers can outsource their last mile management and monitoring to us. It's a really popular service, and it's not hard to see why, right? If you're a global organization, you've got relationships with maybe half a dozen different telcos around the world. Being able to just hand all of that over to an organization like KATO that is not only capable of monitoring those links, but also managing that conversation, I think that's a really powerful use case for a lot of customers. And of course, we don't just take that away, we make that available to the customers. If we raise a ticket with the ISP, that goes into a portal, the customer always has access to that, and then can be as involved or as not involved as they want in that process. So the fourth challenge, probably the biggest challenge when we're out there having conversations with customers, is around traffic management. This is a huge part of what we do. It's not just about connecting A to B, it's about optimizing the traffic that flows between A to B to make sure that applications that should have the highest performance, such as real-time voice, get the bandwidth that they need, and also making sure that applications, again, like real-time voice, which need good quality connections, have things like packet loss mitigation in place to make sure that if any packets do go missing, that we can very quickly supply a substitute and keep the communication going. So just getting back to the MPLS conversation, a very common use case for our customers is a coexistence strategy. It may be permanent, it may be temporary while they're doing their SD-WAN migration. But if along the bottom of the screen, we've got an MPLS connection between two routers, which may also have direct internet access, which you see running along the top of the screen. So we replace those routers with sockets. The sockets can still terminate and manage the MPLS connection. I think that's a really important point. So as well as providing connectivity to the backbone along the top, they can also manage the MPLS along the bottom, and we can differentiate the traffic that flows along these links. So we could have, say, voice and video, real-time voice and video traveling across the KATO backbone because we've got good connectivity there, whereas Office, email, file transfers, database replication, that might travel along the MPLS if it doesn't have as far to go, or if it needs bigger bandwidth, or just simply because the MPLS is there and the contract is still active, and we might as well make use of that link. We can tie our network optimization into the organization's Active Directory. So now we've got user-aware quality of service, traffic routing, and prioritization. So the CEO always has great connectivity. The CIO, maybe not quite so good. Head of HR, maybe not very good at all. Different applications going to different locations, different users, different groups of users can be prioritized. They can be steered across different links. It may be that the CEO always gets lots of bandwidth across the backbone. If the backbone's down, the CEO's traffic immediately switches over to the MPLS. So I mentioned the packet loss mitigation. This is the ability for particular flows to be able to duplicate the packets. So if you've got two links to the internet for, say, real-time voice traffic, we can duplicate those packets across those two links. So if one packet goes missing from one of those links, we will have the copy on the second link that we can immediately re-inject into the stream, and that way the sender and receiver on each end will never know that there was a lost packet. It can have a huge positive impact on the quality of voice calls where there are links that have a bit too much packet loss. The ability to do this on a per flow basis, I think, is really important, because that means that we don't have to duplicate the whole connection, which would obviously effectively double your bandwidth usage. If we're just doing it for specific flows, it's a much more optimal and efficient way to do this kind of packet loss mitigation. So we've been able to optimize that middle mile between our POPs. We can optimize connectivity to the cloud. I mentioned being able to steer traffic to different regions and different data centers. And that really gives us the ability to do what we call multi-segment optimization, where we're optimizing traffic over the internet, we're optimizing traffic to internet sources. We're also doing QoS on the MPLS link as well. One of the first benefits in terms of traffic management that customers get when they deploy our sockets into their site, and it's always a really interesting exercise to go through, is the visibility it gives them. And it is usually, for most customers, a level of visibility that they've not had before. So real-time monitoring of latency, jitter, packet loss, throughput, historical recording of that, so that because we know when users raise issues about network performance, they usually don't do it in real time when you would be able to go in and troubleshoot it live. Right? It's not that a user rings up and says, I've got a problem right now with internet performance. Often it's, well, last week the performance was pretty bad. Well, okay, that was last week. I can't really do anything about it. But if you've got KATO, we actually keep this data for 2 years. Right? 2 years, that is that is a very, very large window of opportunity for an admin to be able to go back and say, well, for the last 2 years, for all of my sites, for all of my VPN users, I can go back and look at 5-minute, 5-second intervals of what was happening on the connection. So if someone does come to you and say, we had a problem last week with the internet, no problem. You can just go straight in there and find out what that was. We can break that down via the different transports. We can go right down to the level of hosts and applications. And I frequently use this with customers. It's not an uncommon scenario where we deploy sockets and the customer's like, well, we've deployed the sockets, but we're still having congestion issues. Very quickly go in there, identify the offenders. Maybe, and we actually had this recently, there were internal users who were trying to access BitTorrent, users browsing, I wouldn't say malicious sites, but certainly sites not approved for business use, maybe a database replication that people weren't aware of. The sockets will tell you exactly what's going on, both in real time and historically back 2 years. The sockets, as well as being identity aware, are application aware. So we have, I think it's about 2,000 different application definitions in there. So they will be able to break it down into things like YouTube. You'll see Facebook, you'll see Instagram called out as specific applications. You'll also see categories in that same list. So things like online shopping, news and media, all of that is there out of the box by default. You don't need to create definitions. They're there for you. It's a really, really great level of visibility that pretty much starts working as soon as the socket is in place and traffic is flowing through it. So the second last challenge I want to talk about is security. And even though we are, I guess we market ourselves as a converged security and networking company, security is very important to us. I came from Imperva, like a lot of other people at KATO, which was a pure security organization. But still, the reason I've put security as number 5 is because for a lot of our customers, it's a bonus. Their main problems are around connectivity, quality of service, traffic optimization, and so forth. When they see the additional security that we can overlay on that, as well as contributing to the Appliance Sprawl challenge, it's just a huge, huge bonus for them. So we see all of the WAN traffic. We see all of the VPN traffic. So in real time, we can immediately do firewalling on that. We have 2 separate firewalls in the product. One is the WAN firewall, so that controls traffic between customer sites, and there is the internet firewall, traffic which is, and requests which are leaving the customer sites and going out to the internet. We have anti-malware inspection, so file transfers, file downloads, we are scanning them in real time. Always, it's there. You can disable it if you want. I'm not sure why you would, but it's there. It provides huge value to our customers. We have a next generation anti-malware. So this is going beyond just signature-based. This is looking at more execution characteristics and heuristics to try and do zero-day malware detection. We have an IPS as well. So this is looking not so much for malicious files, but for malicious traffic. Is someone trying to run a botnet over your WAN? So in other words, users been browsing out to the internet. They weren't on the KATO WAN at the time. They've picked up an infection. They've connected to the WAN either behind a socket or via VPN. All of a sudden, the console will start lighting up. Admins will get alerts. We've got some infected workstations here. On top of the functionality, we've got our SOC. So these are dedicated, experienced security guys working 24/7 who can monitor that, who can help customers hunt for threats and help customers resolve security incidents as they are found. We have a significant advantage over a lot of other IPS vendors, and this advantage, by the way, is not really specific to KATO. This is a generic artifact of the difference between doing things on-prem versus doing things in the cloud. If you are a customer with an IPS, you want to write a custom signature, you've got a fairly limited data set to test that against. You basically have to write it, put it in alert mode, and hope that during your test window, it either gets triggered or doesn't in the right way. Whereas when our guys write an IPS signature, and it's our own IPS, this is not a third-party product. We don't have Appliance Sprawl under the hood. So in our own IPS, when our guys write a signature, they can immediately test it on well over a terabit per second of network traffic, 100,000 hosts, I think something like 20 or 30,000 users running across our backbone at any one time. So that is like a massive test laboratory for our guys to be able to test IPS signatures, so that when they deploy them, they can be very confident that they're not going to generate false positives. It's a significant advantage over DIY on-prem IPS. So customers often ask me, how effective is this? And I show them this slide, and I think this is the best possible proof of the pudding I could provide. So what these are screenshots from an email that some of us internally receive a couple of times a month. This is effectively our SOC saying, this is how much stuff we caught in the last 2-week period. So this is from about 6 weeks ago, and I was astonished to see not just the magnitude of growth over time, but also compared to the number of customers we have, the number of infections we're catching. It implies that something like 30% of our customers at any given time have got infected workstations, have got malicious software that is raising IPS alerts across the network, 30%. So I think that's a really interesting statistic, and it's always interesting to turn this stuff on a customer network, and I can almost guarantee that everyone learns something, everyone catches something. It's very rare for a customer to deploy this stuff and not get some IPS or anti-malware alert within, say, a week or so. So it is an extremely effective approach. A common question I get is, well, does this mean that we can replace all of our internal security controls? Well, no, not really. I think you have to understand what this is doing as opposed to what your other controls are doing. Can this replace a product which is doing antivirus scanning in real time of file downloads for you? Absolutely it can, because that's what we're doing. What about on-prem endpoint antivirus? Well, no, because we're not actually running on your client's workstations all the time. So we're not doing things like runtime execution detection. You should still maintain some functionality there, but things like layer 3-4 firewalling, we have customers that replace their firewalls with us. In network intrusion prevention, customers replace that with us as well. So it's a really good augmentation to an existing suite of security controls. We can add an additional service on that, which is our MDR service, our managed detection and response. And effectively, this is the customer leasing our SOC and having our SOC analysts manage the customer's alert feed, reach out proactively, maybe even apply protection if we see that there is a significant infection or threat in a customer's network. This is extremely popular. And when you consider the cost of trying to run your own SOC 24/7 as opposed to just an incremental uplift onto a KATO SD-WAN contract, I think the business case pretty much writes itself. And speaking of that, the final challenge is the challenge that everyone faces in every single opportunity, in every single relationship, and that's money. Right? With one of my sales guys, Phil, I was at a customer yesterday who started the conversation by saying, actually, we're not looking for the cheapest solution. We're looking for the best possible solution for us. But at the same time, it still has to fit the budget. No one has unlimited pockets. There are things you can do to help the internal business case for an MPLS replacement by SD-WAN. There are things that we can do to help you have that internal conversation. It's about not just comparing the cost of MPLS versus SD-WAN. It's about doing things like comparing the cost of MPLS plus firewall maintenance plus AV maintenance plus IPS maintenance, plus the staff to run all of that versus SD-WAN. And in recognition of the fact that total cost of ownership is not just about license cost, It's an extremely important consideration, especially for enterprise customers. Not only how do we buy this, but then how do we operate it for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever. We have a range of services that we can add to our contracts. Most customers, in fact, I'm not sure I've ever seen a customer who didn't buy at least one of those services. So we dovetail those with the services provided by our partners. Sometimes our partners will substitute those for theirs. We have a very healthy relationship with partners like Bytes, and they can certainly help provide services to ease the deployment as well. So I want to wrap up now by just talking quickly about the blueprint, a blueprint, some suggestions for how to ease MPLS to SD-WAN migration. So there are a range of different options. It doesn't have to be all in. It doesn't have to be a forklift approach. You don't have to, on day one, deploy your SD-WAN, and on day two, turn off your MPLS. We can actually coexist quite happily, as you can see there, with MPLS. Our sockets understand what MPLS is. They can provide quality of service, visibility, and security for flows that are traversing the MPLS. On the other hand, the customer might decide that they want to move away completely from MPLS, and in order to do that, they need to make sure that they have connectivity to the backbone which has similar performance and availability to MPLS. So they have multiple direct internet access connections, and once they're working and they're happy with those, they can switch the MPLS off. Similarly, customers who have previously been running with MPLS plus direct internet access, honestly, if you've got good quality connectivity to the cloud, you probably don't need to retain that. And then there are customers that mix and match. Important sites will have multiple separate uplinks. Less important sites, they might just have a single uplink, maybe with something like a 4G backup link, which again, our sockets can understand 4G. They can terminate that and manage that in an ActivePassive configuration. What is most common is for customers to have mix and match. It doesn't have to be a big bang approach. Like I said, you don't have to do everything all at once. In terms of, I guess, if you decided that you were maybe interested in taking a closer look at KATO, how long does that take and how difficult is that process? These are good questions to ask. So we can provision the KATO client and get that set up and get a customer connected to the backbone just using the client in a matter of minutes. It doesn't take very long at all. Connecting a site to our backbone via IPSec tunnels, we make that very easy for people. We have predefined templates for things like AWS and Azure. That might take 30 minutes. And if we wanted to get the full benefit and visibility provided by the socket, we can ship those out in a fairly short space of time. They are designed to be as minimal hands-on deployment as possible. You effectively connect the socket to the internet. It will automatically try to get DHCP. It will automatically try to find a way to the KATO backbone. And as soon as it does, it pops up in the customer's console and says, here I am, which site would you like to allocate me to? And once it's in the site, it can start providing DHCP to internal users. It will basically try and do everything it can to do as much of the deployment as possible. And in general, most customers in most KATO POCs do most of the deployment themselves. I've never had to go on KATO deployment. So then I just want to wrap up with some strategies. So strategies for successfully migrating MPLS to SD-WAN. This is not something official. This is just my own learning and observation from working with KATO customers. So the first thing is around appliance sprawl and around budget justification. Don't just look at the contractual cost of MPLS versus the contractual cost of SD-WAN. Think about the additional savings. It will make it easier for you to get internal support for an SD-WAN project. SD-WAN is a relatively new market, and what we're seeing is that the market is evolving rapidly, and third-party analysts like Gartner are actually starting to pick it apart and almost reorganize it. And we're seeing a new emerging classification called Secure Access Service Edge. It is apparently pronounced officially SASE. I'm not making it up. It's there on the Gartner site. So Gartner have already released a research report. Unfortunately, it's a private report. I can't make that available to you. If you have a Gartner account, you would be able to go in and possibly have a look at that. But what it means is that we can expect a lot of change in this market over the next few years. So I think it's important to look for a vendor that has good growth and has a solid foundation and is likely to be around 12 months from now. And I think KATO certainly ticks those boxes. I think this is a no-brainer, right? If you have international sites, an SD-WAN vendor who has a global backbone is almost always going to be a better bet than someone who doesn't and is still relying on IPSec tunnels over the internet. You don't really need an SD-WAN vendor if that's what you want to do. You can pretty much do that yourselves these days, even with just a Linux box. Common garden variety firewalls will do IPSec, no problem. This is a really important point. We often have a conversation with customers who say, well, I really like your SD-WAN solution, but we're still locked in to our MPLS for another 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, whatever. So, I think we have to wait until that time. Well, you don't. A good SD-WAN vendor, good partners have ways of helping customers work around that. And I'm talking here about commercial ways. So I'm a tech, I'm not the sales guy. That's about as deeply as I can go into it. But my advice to you is that if you're not 100% happy with your current MPLS solution, you would like to look at SD-WAN, you don't have to wait until you're approaching the end of life for your MPLS before you have that conversation. I would strongly encourage you to go out and have that conversation today. Just a personal bugbear of mine, because I'm one of the guys at KATO that runs proofs of concept with customers. It would be a really good idea if before embarking on the POC, you have a sit down internally and think, what is it that we want to test and how are we going to measure that? I will have that conversation with you anyway, but like I said, it will save time and it will help you, I guess, clarify in your own mind what you're looking for if you start having those conversations internally. And then finally, very common scenario for us is that we go to a customer and of course, like every other SD-WAN vendor, we size on size of connection. So we'll ask them what their connections are and they'll say, well, we've got 10 sites, each one's got 100 meg to the internet. Actually, the telco has sold them 10 100 meg connections. They might not necessarily be using 100 meg at each site. So it's very common for KATO customers that even if their connection to the internet is 100 meg, they might buy a smaller amount of bandwidth on that. Obviously, it becomes a more cost-effective way of doing SD-WAN. And because we've got quality of service and prioritization, that traffic management functionality built in, we can help customers effectively do more with less on their last mile connections. So I want to finish by just talking briefly about who KATO is. So we are a startup. We've been shipping product in stealth mode since 2016, I think officially since 2017. We're in the very happy position for a startup and that we're now turning away venture capital money. So we've got enough investment, we've got very strong cash flow, we've got a lot of enterprise customers. We add to that every single month. We are basically in a good position, and even though I'm nowhere near being a market analyst, it kind of feels like we're on the path to transition out of startup status at some time in the not too distant future. Our founders are Shlomo Kramer, the man who founded Checkpoint, then founded Imperva, and Ger Schatz, who founded Encapsula, which was also part of the Shlomo and Imperva stable as well. So that's all I've got today. I apologize if I've run over a little bit. I think now, Shona, I might be handing back to you for Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like to encourage anyone to, if you either the chat or the questions box, if you'd like to send Peter any comments, any questions, I will pose them to him as well. While you are hopefully merrily typing away, I'd also just like to thank Peter for his detailed presentation today. thank everyone for their time in attending, because obviously I appreciate, particularly on a Friday morning, spending an hour looking at SD-WAN, maybe not as easy to do in other things when we've all got very busy diaries and schedules. So thank you all for attending this morning. So I do have a first question here for you, Peter. So it's around latency. If we connect to your network via the internet, how can you guarantee latency?
So there's a number of things that we can do. The first one is because we ourselves have guaranteed latency between our POPs, so we can provide a very consistent measurement. And one of the things that I'll often do during a POC is measure latency both over the KATO backbone and going direct out to the internet. And of course, what we almost always see, what we want to see is that it's quicker to send stuff over the KATO backbone versus not over the KATO backbone. But actually, the most value that customers get is not so much from our reduced latency, it's our ability to control the traffic on the last mile. So because we can do quality of service and prioritization, even if the latency is not great across the last mile, and therefore there's not much we can do about that, because we can ensure that important traffic is prioritized, that has huge benefit. And the example I often give is actually my own house. So I live in a fairly remote part of Oxfordshire. I have a terrible internet connection. I have a socket on there, and even though I'm not running a WAN, so I don't really need backbone connectivity, just the socket's ability to prioritize traffic and to show me what's currently using and abusing the link means that I can effectively compensate for the poor latency on that connection by boosting, if you like, the important application traffic at the expense of the less important application traffic.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that's answered your question or gone some way to do that. Obviously, I can make sure that your account manager reaches out to you with any necessary documentation around that for that particular person. I have another question here. So it's around differentiation from some competitors in the space and some other SD-WAN players. How does KATO differentiate from the likes of, say, Meraki?
So I'll talk generally rather than talk about specific vendors, because there are quite a few vendors in this space, and so we tend to come across, I'll call them the usual suspects, and I don't mean that at all disrespectfully. So I think our biggest single differentiator is our global backbone. There are not many vendors have a global backbone, so when we're talking about that global connectivity use case, that gives us huge advantages in terms of latency and connection quality. So global backbone is a huge differentiator for us. The other big differentiator for us is the security stack that we can incorporate. So the quality and functionality in our firewalling, in our anti-malware inspection, and our intrusion prevention. Global backbone with a full service security stack, if those are important to you, then we are definitely going to be part of the conversation.
Lovely. And then lastly, so far, a question around client devices. Do end users get full visibility of what client devices are doing on the LAN at remote sites?
So do end users get visibility?
So would customers, sorry, apologies.
Okay, so if I can slightly rephrase that, would customer administrators of the KATO solution get full? They get a very, very large amount of visibility. So they will be able to know for each device which applications are being accessed, how much bandwidth is being used, what quality of service bucket that those applications are going into. So you get a very significant amount of visibility down to the level of domain names and sites being accessed.
Perfect. Again, that's something that if you would like to pick up separately with the Bytes account manager, we can provide some information or materials around this. And a question about level 7 monitoring is, does that mean there's no need for level 7 monitoring at the remote site? Or does it replace the need for level 7 monitoring?
So a lot of our customers are able to replace their layer 7 monitoring with our solution. We are doing things like TLS inspection, for example, and clearly that can be controlled. You might have certain sites that you don't want to inspect for privacy reasons, so we can do that. And in fact, on my home socket, I do that for demonstration purposes. I've declared that the banking category will not be TLS inspected. But I think for most customers, they would be able to replace their layer 7 monitoring with the KATO solution, especially on remote sites where they may not currently have much anyway.
Thank you. So all that it remains for me to do, I don't have any further questions at the moment. So I'd just like to thank you for your time. Thank you for your questions as well. Any that we haven't covered to the extent that you'd like us to, more than happy to take that offline after the webinar. Thanks very much, Peter, for coming along today and for presenting. Thanks to you all for taking an hour out of your morning to listen. And then we will make sure that you receive the webinar recording and the slides, available slides, by the end of the day today, if not Monday, so that you can share that information with your team and review it at your leisure. If you could just take 2 seconds to fill out the short survey at the end, that would be great as well. Personal request from me. Thanks, everyone, and good morning.